Look at the images people pass around now. Women in miniskirts walking through Tehran, neon-lit boulevards, university campuses alive with ambition, Western suits, French hairstyles, cinemas, luxury hotels, modern highways, glossy magazines, international airlines, state ceremonies staged with imperial confidence. And the first reaction is almost always the same. Wait, this was Iran? That shock is the doorway into the story, because the images are real. Pre-1979 Iran, especially in parts of Tehran and among the urban middle and upper classes, could look startlingly secular, stylish, and globally connected. Under Mohammad Reza Shah, the state pushed an aggressive modernization project that expanded education, industry, women's suffrage, and urban development, especially after the launch of the White Revolution in 1963. But the deeper question is not whether those images were fake. It is whether they told the truth. Because a country is never just what its photographs choose to show. A capital city is never the same thing as a civilization, and a glamorous surface can sometimes be the most dangerous moment in a nation's life, not the safest. The tragedy of pre-1979 Iran is that what looked, from the outside, like confidence and progress, was also the mask of a system becoming more brittle, more restless, and more vulnerable than it seemed. That is the first thing most people miss. They see the before and after. Before 1979, modern clothes, modern buildings, modern nightlife. After 1979, revolution, veiling, rupture, and the birth of the Islamic Republic. And because the contrast is so visually dramatic, the story gets flattened into a kind of instant morality play. One side is freedom, the other is repression. One side is modern, the other is backward. But history almost never moves in such clean lines. The Iran before 1979 was not simply a liberal paradise that vanished overnight. It was a country being transformed at extraordinary speed by a monarchy determined to force modernity from above. That transformation was real. It changed laws, cities, education, infrastructure, the economy, and public life. But it also tore at older loyalties, deepened inequality, and made millions of people feel that the country they lived in and the country being advertised to the world were no longer the same place. And that is where this story becomes far more unsettling than nostalgia. Because the Iran in those photographs was not the opposite of the revolution that came next. In many ways, it was part of the same chain of events. The very state that built highways, universities, and glittering showcases of modern life was also building resentment, centralizing power, and silencing opposition. The same monarchy that wanted to look unstoppable was creating the conditions for a collapse that would shock the world. You can feel the contradiction just by looking closely. The camera loves confidence. It loves architecture. It loves fashionable streets and elegant interiors and the visual theater of progress. It does not easily capture fear. It does not capture humiliation. It does not capture what happens when reform arrives too fast for some, too unevenly for others, and too arrogantly for a society still arguing with itself about religion, authority, class, foreign influence, and identity. So yes, there were discos, there were fashion magazines, there were women in universities, professionals in modern offices, and a capital city trying to place itself in the orbit of Europe and the United States. There was oil money, state ambition, and a monarchy that wanted Iran to look like the future. But there was also censorship, surveillance, dislocation, and a growing sense among very different groups of people that something essential was being decided without them. And that is why this story matters so much now. Because people still use those images as a shortcut. Some use them to mourn a lost Iran. Some use them to mock what came after. Some use them to make a political point in a single frame. But the real story is more powerful than any one image, because it forces us to confront something much harder to admit. A country can modernize and still be unstable. It can liberalize certain spaces while hardening power at the center. It can look dazzling, even sophisticated, even liberated, while pressure is building underneath the floorboards. And when that pressure finally bursts, the photographs survive longer than the illusions that produce them. So this is not just a video about what Iran looked like before 1979. It is a story about what those images could not show. About how a monarchy tried to drag a nation into a new age. About why so many people admired that project, feared it, benefited from it, hated it, or felt erased by it. About how one of the most visually striking transformations in the modern Middle East ended not in stability, but in revolution. And about why the world that seemed to shine so brightly in those old frames may already have been closer to breaking than anyone wanted to believe. Because behind the photographs, behind the glamour, behind the promise of progress, there was a wound. And that wound had a history. To understand why pre-1979 Iran looked so modern by the end, you have to go back to the moment when its future was bent out of shape. Not in 1979, not even in the 1960s, but in the early 1950s, when Iran was fighting over something far more explosive than fashion, architecture, or social reform. It was fighting over power, over oil, over who had the right to decide what Iran was for and who it belonged to. At the center of that struggle stood Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist prime minister who became a symbol of something bigger than himself. In 1951, he moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, challenging British control over a resource that many Iranians saw as the clearest example of foreign extraction and national humiliation. For millions, this was not just an economic dispute. It was a test of sovereignty. Could Iran control its own wealth? Or would outside powers always decide the limits of Iranian independence? This is what makes the story so important. Before the Shah became the face of rapid modernization, before Tehran became a showcase of state ambition, the political heart of Iran was already marked by a deeper memory. The sense that whenever the country tried to stand on its own terms, someone stronger would step in and redraw the map. Mossadegh became immensely popular because he seemed to embody the opposite of submission. He was not promising a cosmetic transformation. He was confronting the structure beneath it. But the struggle quickly escalated into a crisis involving the monarchy, parliament, foreign governments, and the future of the Iranian state itself. Tension between Mossadegh and Mohammad Reza Shah sharpened into a direct contest over who truly held authority. And by 1953, that contest had reached the breaking point. Then came the rupture. In August 1953, after an earlier failed attempt and days of turmoil, Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup backed by the United States and the United Kingdom. The Shah, who had fled the country during the crisis, returned with his position restored. Around 300 people were killed in the fighting in Tehran. But the deeper consequences would last far longer than the street battles themselves. The coup did not just remove a prime minister. It changed the emotional architecture of Iranian politics. Because from that point on, the Shah's power carried a shadow that never really disappeared. He was still king. He still had real supporters. He still represented stability to some and continuity to others. But after 1953, his rule also became tied, in the minds of many Iranians, to foreign intervention and to the crushing of a nationalist alternative. Even people who disagreed about ideology could agree on one thing: something essential had been broken. The monarchy did not simply survive the crisis. It survived it with outside help. And that fact lodged itself deep in the national memory. And this is where the story turns. Because you might imagine that a monarchy restored in such dramatic fashion would respond with caution, humility, maybe even compromise. But that is not what happened. The lesson the Shah seems to have taken from the crisis was not that Iran needed a broader political settlement. It was that disorder had to be prevented before it could grow. Opposition had to be contained. Power had to be centralized. The state had to become strong enough, modern enough, and fast enough that no one could challenge it again. In one sense, that logic is easy to understand. Iran had been politically fragmented, economically pressured, and entangled with foreign powers for decades. The Shah and his allies believed the answer was a disciplined, top-down transformation of the country. Build the roads, build the factories, build the schools, build the military. Build the image of a nation moving forward so decisively that the old chaos could never return. But there was a trap hidden inside that ambition. Because when modernization grows out of a wound, it does not erase the wound. It often hardens around it. The state becomes obsessed with control. Progress becomes inseparable from obedience. Development becomes something delivered from above, not negotiated from below. And the more dazzling the project looks, the more dangerous it becomes if the people living inside it begin to feel that they were never truly asked for their consent. That is why 1953 matters so much to everything that came later. It helps explain why the Shah's Iran could look so confident and yet feel so fragile. Why modernity arrived with such force, but legitimacy remained unresolved. Why the regime would pour its energy into spectacle, reform, and expansion, while the memory of dependency and coercion kept burning underneath. The coup did not cause the 1979 revolution in any simple mechanical way, but it planted one of the deepest suspicions in modern Iranian life, that power in Iran could wear a national face while serving a deeper logic of control. And once that suspicion takes root, every reform starts to look different. Every promise sounds less innocent. Every display of strength begins to feel like compensation for something unresolved. After 1953, the Shah was not just ruling Iran. He was trying to outrun a legitimacy crisis with speed, steel, oil, and spectacle. And soon, he would try to remake the entire country before that crisis caught up with him. If 1953 gave the Shah back his throne, the next phase was about turning that restored power into a whole new Iran. Not gradually, not carefully, but at speed. By the early 1960s, Mohammad Reza Shah was no longer content to simply survive. He wanted transformation. He wanted a monarchy that would not just rule the country, but redesign it. Villages, cities, schools, land ownership, women's rights, industry, literacy, culture, even the rhythm of daily life. Everything was now part of the project. This was the White Revolution. The name itself was revealing. A revolution, but white. A revolution without the chaos of crowds, without the uncertainty of real popular power. A revolution from above, managed by the palace, announced as progress, wrapped in the language of reform. Land redistribution, literacy campaigns, infrastructure, industrial development, expanded education, greater participation for women in public life. The Shah was offering not merely change, but a new national identity. Iran would no longer be old, poor, fragmented, and vulnerable. It would be modern, disciplined, ambitious, and unmistakably on the move. And for many people, this was not an illusion. It was real. Schools expanded, roads spread, state institutions reached farther into daily life. Rural literacy campaigns brought education into places long neglected. Women gained the right to vote and entered universities and professions in larger numbers. In the cities, especially in Tehran, the signs of modern life became harder to ignore. Concrete, glass, cars, offices, ministries, new consumer goods, new expectations, new language about what the future was supposed to look like. For a generation of Iranians, this felt exhilarating. At last, a state that was not just drifting with history, but trying to seize it. And yet, even at its most impressive, the White Revolution contained the contradiction that would later tear the whole system apart. Because reform imposed from above can create movement without creating trust. It can create visible progress without creating belonging. It can transform the surface of a society while leaving the deeper question unresolved. Who is this transformation really for? That question began to matter almost immediately. Land reform, for example, was meant to weaken old feudal structures and strengthen the state's social base. But reform in the countryside did not produce the clean triumph the Shah seemed to imagine. Some large landowners were weakened, yes, but many small farmers ended up with too little land to build secure lives, while older rural systems of dependence and support were disrupted without being replaced by something equally stable. The result, for many, was not freedom in the romantic sense. It was uncertainty, dislocation, a new kind of fragility. And when rural life becomes unstable, people move. They moved toward the cities. They moved toward the promise. They moved toward the image the state itself was projecting. This is one of the most important turns in the story, because the White Revolution did not just modernize Iran, it accelerated Iran. It pulled millions into a faster, harsher, more uneven world. Urban growth exploded. Expectations rose faster than institutions could absorb them. A new middle class emerged, but so did new frustrations, new inequalities, new cultural distances between those inside the modernizing project and those left staring at it from the edges. The Shah saw speed as strength, but speed has a cost. The faster the state moved, the more it disrupted the social fabric it claimed to be rescuing. The more it celebrated modern life, the more it provoked those who saw this project not as national renewal, but as cultural uprooting. The more it concentrated power in the name of reform, the more it made reform itself feel less like a shared future and more like a command. And then there was the deeper problem. The Shah believed that success would solve legitimacy, that if he built enough, changed enough, dazzled enough, the old questions would disappear. But roads do not erase memory. Schools do not settle spiritual conflict. Factories do not automatically produce political loyalty. A government can modernize agriculture, expand universities, and promote women's participation in public life, and still leave millions feeling that the nation's direction is being dictated, not debated. That is why the White Revolution was both the Shah's greatest achievement and the beginning of his greatest danger. Because it worked. And because it worked, it changed everything. It made Iran look stronger, faster, more ambitious, more alive. But it also shattered old balances, raised new expectations, and drew a sharper line between the country the monarchy wanted to display and the country people were actually living in. What looked like a confident march into the future was also the start of a widening fracture between the glowing image of modern Iran and the uneasy reality underneath it. In the capital, that image would become dazzling, almost hypnotic. But beyond the bright surfaces, something far less stable was taking shape. Because as Tehran began to glitter, the rest of Iran was starting to feel the strain. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Shah's Iran had found its showcase, Tehran. If you wanted proof that the country was changing, this was where the monarchy wanted you to look. Wide avenues, luxury hotels, international conferences, modern apartment blocks, fashion boutiques, nightclubs, state television, expanding universities, corporate towers. A capital city learning how to perform confidence in glass, concrete, perfume, and speed. And it worked. For visitors, for journalists, for diplomats, even for many Iranians living inside that new urban world, Tehran could feel like the visible future. A city stretching itself upward and outward, determined to announce that Iran was no longer an old kingdom on the edge of modernity, but a rising power with money, ambition, and a ruler who intended to leave history behind. But this is where the photographs become dangerous, because a capital city can make a national project look more coherent than it really is. It can compress complexity into a single, glamorous frame. It can make transformation seem universal when it is actually uneven, selective, and fragile. Tehran was not a lie. It was something more complicated than that. It was real, but partial. It was the brightest expression of a state-driven future that millions could see, but not all could enter on equal terms. This is the contradiction that begins to sharpen in this part of the story. The more Tehran glittered, the more visible the gap became between those who were thriving inside the new Iran and those who were being reshaped by it without sharing fully in its rewards. Modernization was creating new winners. Professionals, technocrats, business elites, urban families with access to education, state employment, and the expanding economy. But it was also producing new forms of exclusion, especially for those arriving from the countryside, displaced by earlier reforms and drawn toward cities whose promises were easier to advertise than to deliver. They came looking for work, stability, dignity, a place in the future. What many found instead was a harsher reality: overcrowding, inflation, uneven access, the humiliation of being close enough to see the new life, but not close enough to live it. In every fast, modernizing society, There is a moment when aspiration outruns structure. Iran was hitting that moment hard. Expectations were rising faster than institutions could absorb them. The dream was expanding faster than the social foundation beneath it. And dreams, when they become unevenly distributed, do not calm a country. They agitate it. The Shah's state wanted Iran to look modern not only economically, but culturally. There was a strong secularizing impulse to the project, especially in elite urban spaces. Public life was meant to signal movement away from clerical authority, away from old hierarchies, away from what the regime considered backwardness. But modernity imposed as a national aesthetic can feel liberating to some and deeply alienating to others. What looked like progress in North Tehran could look, from another angle, like estrangement, like erasure, like a message that the culture of power no longer spoke in a language many people recognized as their own. And that feeling mattered. Because revolutions do not emerge only from poverty. They also emerge from humiliation, from status anxiety, from the feeling that the country is being transformed around you by people who think your world is disposable. The more the monarchy celebrated its own success, the more it risked turning resentment into a moral force. Not just among the poor, not just among the rural dispossessed, but among bazaar merchants, religious families, students, intellectuals, and many others who increasingly saw the official image of Iran as too polished to be trusted. That distrust was fed by something else as well: corruption. Not always in the crude sense people imagine, but in the broader atmosphere of favoritism, court excess, elite insulation, and a growing belief that power and privilege were clustering at the top, while the language of national progress was being used to sanctify it. The monarchy spoke in the language of development, but many people saw a system that seemed to reward proximity to power as much as talent or merit. And once a regime begins to look self-congratulatory, even its achievements start to feel compromised. That is what made Tehran so potent and so dangerous at the same time. It was the miracle on display, and it was the accusation. It proved that the Shah could build, but it also reminded the country, every single day, how unevenly that future was being lived. Beneath the glamour was a widening emotional distance between the state and society, between image and legitimacy, between those who felt represented by the new Iran and those who felt talked over by it. And here's the part the glossy memories usually leave out. The regime could sense this tension. It knew that spectacle alone was not enough. It knew that admiration could turn to contempt. It knew that rapid change creates enemies as well as loyalists. Which is why, while Tehran was learning how to shine, the state was sharpening another instrument entirely. Not persuasion, not compromise, control. And behind the dazzling surface of modern Iran, the machinery of fear was already waiting. Modern Iran was not built by architecture alone. It was built by fear. That is the part the photographs almost never capture. The wide roads, the elegant hotels, the women in universities, the ministries, the shopping districts, the polished ceremonies, the language of progress. All of it was meant to signal confidence, stability, a nation advancing under firm direction. But behind that carefully managed image stood another Iran, quieter and harder to photograph. An Iran of surveillance, censorship, prison cells, whispered caution, and a political atmosphere in which too much honesty could become dangerous. At the center of that hidden system was Savak, the Shah's intelligence and security service. Its job was not simply to protect the state from violent threats. It became, over time, one of the most feared symbols of the regime itself. For opposition figures, students, intellectuals, clerics, activists, and even ordinary people who learned to watch their words, Savak represented a simple truth. The monarchy was modernizing the country, yes, but it was also narrowing the space in which anyone could question how that modernization was being carried out. This is what makes the Shah's project so difficult to understand if you only look at the surface. Because repression did not appear in spite of modernization, it appeared alongside it. In some ways, it was built into it. After 1953, the monarchy had learned a brutal lesson. Disorder was dangerous. Opposition could grow. Political pluralism could produce instability. So the answer, from the palace's point of view, was not to open the system and absorb criticism. It was to manage society more tightly, to shape the future from above, and to make sure that no rival force, whether nationalist, leftist, clerical, or democratic, could organize strongly enough to threaten the center again. That created a strange kind of country, a country where development was celebrated, but dissent was suspect. A country where ambition was encouraged, but only within boundaries set by power. A country where the state wanted educated citizens, modern professionals, and globally fluent elites, but not independent political forces with enough confidence to challenge the monarchy itself. You could see the contradiction everywhere once you knew where to look. Universities expanded, but campuses could become sites of unrest. Newspapers existed, but the limits of what could be said were never entirely invisible. Political life continued, but increasingly in forms that felt managed, constrained, or theatrical. The Shah wanted motion without unpredictability, change without loss of control, a modern nation without the messiness of real political contest. But history rarely grants that bargain. Because when a state modernizes society, it also creates people who think more, ask more, compare more, and expect more. Educated classes do not always become obedient classes. Urban growth does not guarantee loyalty. Economic development does not dissolve moral outrage. Sometimes it sharpens it. Sometimes the very people produced by the system become the people most capable of seeing its contradictions. And the harsher the state becomes in response, the more it reveals its own insecurity. That is the deeper significance of repression in the Shah's Iran. It was not just a tool of strength. It was also evidence of fear. A regime that truly believes in its own legitimacy does not need to monitor thought so aggressively. It does not need to train society to speak in lowered voices. It does not need to make criticism feel like a risk calculation. The more the monarchy advertised certainty, the more it depended on an apparatus that suggested certainty was exactly what it lacked. And once fear enters public life deeply enough, it changes a nation in ways that are hard to reverse. It isolates people from each other. It pushes anger inward. It makes formal politics feel useless, and informal networks feel vital. It teaches citizens that the truth is not spoken in official spaces, but in private rooms, behind closed doors, in circles of trust, in coded language, in religious gatherings, in exile, in memory. Repression does not eliminate opposition. More often, it changes its form. It drives it underground, where it can become harder to measure and more dangerous to ignore. This is why the polished image of the Shah's Iran was always more brittle than it looked. The system appeared strong because public disorder could be contained, because criticism could be muted, because spectacle could fill the screen while fear kept silence in place. But silence is not the same as loyalty. It is often just pressure with nowhere visible to go. And pressure, when it has no outlet, does not disappear. It accumulates. By the time Iran looked strongest, richest, and most modern, it may already have been carrying a deeper instability than the monarchy understood. Not because progress was fake, it was not. Not because the state had no achievements, it did. But because a country cannot be modernized forever at gunpoint, in whispers, under watch, while being told that its obedience is proof of national unity. Soon, the people pushed to the margins of this official Iran would begin to find each other. Not in the bright spaces the monarchy controlled, but in the networks it underestimated. And among them was a voice the Shah believed he had already pushed out of history. One of the Shah's biggest mistakes was not just underestimating his enemies, it was misunderstanding what kind of enemies they were. Because from the monarchy's point of view, the direction of history seemed obvious. Cities were growing. Universities were expanding. The state was centralizing. New elites were emerging. Western fashions, secular institutions, industrial planning, oil-fueled ambition, all of it seemed to point in one direction. Forward, away from the old Iran, away from clerical authority, away from the social worlds the palace saw as obstacles to national progress. And that is exactly where the regime began to misread the country. Because old Iran did not disappear, it adapted. Nowhere was that clearer than in the rise of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Later, the world would see him return in 1979 like a figure arriving at the climax of the story. But in reality, he had been part of the pressure building underneath the system for years. He did not emerge from nowhere. He emerged from a conflict the Shah believed he had already contained. In the early 1960s, as the White Revolution accelerated, Khomeini became one of its fiercest critics. Not because he opposed all change in some simple, frozen sense, but because he saw the Shah's project as something much larger and more dangerous than reform. In his eyes, the monarchy was not merely modernizing Iran, it was hollowing it out, weakening religious authority, expanding state power, deepening foreign influence, reordering society from above while calling that domination progress. That message mattered because it spoke to a fear many people already felt but could not always articulate. The fear that modernization was coming with a price deeper than economics. That Iran was not simply changing, but being spiritually and politically uprooted. That a state could build roads, schools, and ministries while also severing people from the moral language through which they understood legitimacy itself. The Shah treated this resistance as something temporary, manageable, a residue of the past. But history is full of regimes that confuse visibility with victory. Just because an older form of authority no longer dominates the skyline does not mean it has lost the ground beneath it. Mosques remained. Religious networks remained. Bizarre relationships remained. Clerical influence remained. Family loyalties remained. Ritual remained. Memory remained. And unlike the polished institutions of the state, these were not always easy to monitor, stage manage, or absorb. That was the danger. The monarchy could control official politics. It could censor newspapers. It could pressure universities. It could intimidate activists. but it could not fully replace the dense, emotional, moral networks that had shaped Iranian society long before the Pahlavi state reached for total authority. And every time the regime pushed harder in the name of progress, it gave those networks something new to organize against. Then came exile. Khomeini was arrested, then expelled from Iran. From the Shah's perspective, this should have solved the problem. Remove the man, weaken the movement, restore order. It was the logic of the centralized state. Cut off the head, and the body will fail. But exile can be a strange kind of power, because once outside Iran, Khomeini was no longer just a domestic critic. He became something more elusive, a voice that could not be fully silenced, a figure distant enough to grow in symbolic force, yet close enough through sermons, tapes, networks, and loyal intermediaries to remain present in Iranian political life. The regime had pushed him out physically, but in doing so, it helped transform him into something larger than a local dissident. It gave him myth, and myths travel. This is what the Shah never fully grasped. Opposition to his rule was not only ideological, it was emotional. It was civilizational. It was increasingly held together by a language of betrayal, authenticity, justice, and moral injury. Secular intellectuals had their grievances. Students had theirs. Workers had theirs. Nationalists had theirs. But religious opposition offered something uniquely powerful, a framework that could turn political resentment into sacred urgency. That changed the stakes. Because now the monarchy was not simply accused of corruption or repression. It was being judged as illegitimate in a deeper register. Not just ineffective, not just unjust, but fundamentally alien to the soul of the nation it claimed to modernize. And that accusation did not stay confined to seminaries or clerical circles. It moved outward, into bazaars, into homes, into sermons, into whispers, into the growing conviction that the Iran being built by the palace was impressive, yes, but somehow hollow, energetic, but estranged, powerful, but increasingly unloved. The Shah believed he was outgrowing old Iran. What he did not see was that old Iran was studying him, adapting to him, and learning how to survive inside the very world he was building. And just as that forgotten opposition was gathering force in the shadows, the monarchy made another fateful move. It became richer than ever before, and far more dangerous because of it. Then came the money. Not just more money, a flood. In the 1970s, rising oil revenues transformed the Shah's ambitions from enormous to imperial. Iran was no longer simply modernizing, it was surging. The state had more cash, more reach, more confidence, more ability to build, buy, arm, expand, and announce itself to the world as a power that had finally broken free from weakness. If the earlier years had been about remaking Iran, now the monarchy began to imagine something even grander, that it could dominate its own future. This is the moment when pre-1979 Iran starts to feel almost unreal in hindsight. The boom was visible everywhere. Construction intensified, imports poured in, the military expanded, grand plans multiplied. The regime spoke in the language of destiny, scale, acceleration. Iran would not just catch up, it would leap ahead. The country would become a model of rapid development, a regional giant, a state too rich, too modern, too armed, and too advanced to be challenged by the old forces that had once resisted it. And for a while, that confidence looked persuasive. This was the intoxicating phase of the Shah's rule. The phase when power stopped sounding defensive and began to sound triumphant. The monarchy was no longer reacting to crisis. It was staging permanence. Iran's image abroad grew more glamorous, more assertive, more expensive. The state could afford spectacle now. It could afford to dramatize itself. And dramatize itself it did. Nothing captured that mood more than the grand celebrations of Persian imperial history, where the monarchy wrapped itself in the grandeur of ancient kingship and civilizational continuity. The message was unmistakable. This was not just a ruler governing a modernizing state. This was an heir to empire, presiding over a nation that had returned to history not as a victim, but as a force. The pageantry was meant to dazzle the world. It also told many Iranians something else: that the monarchy had begun to confuse grandeur with legitimacy. Because oil wealth can make a regime feel stronger than it really is, it can hide inefficiency. It can blur the difference between state capacity and public support. It can create the illusion that power is secure simply because it is expensive. The Shah could build more, purchase more, command more, and imagine more. But money does not automatically deepen loyalty. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes sudden wealth magnifies every weakness already inside a system. And Iran had weaknesses everywhere beneath the gleaming surface. The oil boom overheated the economy. Prices rose. Inequality became harder to ignore. Corruption felt more visible because the scale of wealth had become so enormous. Consumption expanded, but so did resentment. The regime's ambitions grew faster than its ability to manage the social consequences of its own success. For those near power, the decade could feel exhilarating. For many others, it felt unstable, inflated, and arrogant. That arrogance mattered, because the richer the monarchy became, the more it seemed to believe that opposition was no longer a serious threat. Critics were outdated. Clerics were relics. Dissenters were small. Students could be managed. Workers could be handled. The old anxieties that had once haunted the Shah appeared, from inside the palace, to be fading into irrelevance. Oil had changed the scale of the game. The state was too big now, too resourced, too modern, too invincible. But that was the illusion. The real danger of wealth is not only excess, it is misreading reality. It is beginning to believe that because you can purchase loyalty, you have earned it. Because you can flood a country with development, you have healed its wounds. Because you can expand the military, you have stabilized the nation. Because the skyline rises, the ground beneath it must be solid. The Shah's Iran was now full of visible power and hidden brittleness. The state looked enormous, but its legitimacy remained thin in crucial places. The economy was expanding, but the emotional distance between the ruling order and many of its people was widening. The monarchy had become richer, yes, but wealth had not dissolved the old grievances. It had amplified them, sharpened them, and made the ruling elite look even more insulated from the society they claimed to be transforming. And the more the regime celebrated itself, the easier it became for its enemies to portray it as decadent, detached, and morally exhausted. That is what made this phase so dangerous. The Shah was not collapsing. He was ascending. But sometimes, ascent is the most unstable moment of all. Because when a regime reaches the point where it can no longer imagine its own vulnerability, it starts making mistakes no amount of money can correct. It becomes louder when it should listen, harsher when it should bend, more theatrical when it should be sober, more certain when the country beneath it is already shifting. By the late 1970s, Iran looked stronger than ever, which was exactly why so few people were prepared for what happened next. Because once the first cracks reached the streets, the illusion of invincibility would vanish almost overnight. Every brittle regime has a moment when fear stops flowing in one direction. For years, the Shah's state had trained Iran to absorb pressure in silence. People could grumble in private, complain in trusted circles, resent the court, distrust the official image, even hate what the monarchy had become. But hatred is not yet revolt. Resentment is not yet movement. A population can live under tension for years if each part of society feels alone, isolated, cut off from the others, uncertain whether anyone else is ready to move. Then, suddenly, they are not alone. And that is when everything changes. By the late 1970s, the forces opposing the Shah were still deeply different from one another. Clerics did not imagine Iran the same way secular intellectuals did. Bazaar merchants did not share the same vision as leftist students. Nationalists, workers, urban poor, religious conservatives, reformists, radicals, all of them carried different grievances, different hopes, different fears. Under normal conditions, that kind of fragmentation protects a regime. But Iran was no longer living under normal conditions. Because what the Shah had managed to do, without fully realizing it, was unite people who agreed on almost nothing except one thing. The monarchy had become intolerable. For some, it was foreign dependence. For others, repression. For others, corruption, inequality, arrogance, cultural uprooting, spiritual betrayal, economic instability, or the suffocating sense that the entire system had become deaf. Their reasons were not identical. Their anger did not need to be. This is what made the protest wave so dangerous. It was not just opposition. It was convergence. The old boundaries that had kept resentment separated began to weaken. Religious mourning rituals became political gatherings. Students and clerics who spoke different ideological languages found themselves moving inside the same emotional storm. The bazaar, long underestimated by elite narratives of modern Iran, emerged again as a powerful social force. Workers began to matter in a new way. Urban crowds grew harder to intimidate. A society that had been managed through fear, spectacle, and fragmentation was beginning to discover its own scale. And once people see their own numbers, the state's aura starts to shrink. That process did not happen in one clean line. It surged, retreated, hardened, surged again. There were demonstrations, crackdowns, funerals, more demonstrations. Death itself became part of the movement's rhythm. Each act of repression created new mourning. Each mourning created new mobilization. The regime was no longer facing isolated critics. It was facing a cycle, one the state could wound, but not stop. That is one of the darkest ironies of the final Shah years. The monarchy had built an enormous machine for control. Yet now, every display of force seemed to produce more defiance. The security state could still kill. It could still arrest. It could still terrify. But it could no longer restore the old psychological order. The people in the streets were no longer simply asking for reforms inside the system. Increasingly, they were testing whether the system itself still had the right to exist. Then came Black Friday. In September 1978, troops opened fire on demonstrators in Tehran's Jaleh Square. The exact death toll became fiercely contested, and rumor magnified the horror. But in political terms, the effect was devastating. Whether through grief, outrage, or the sheer collapse of trust, a line had been crossed. The regime's violence no longer looked like the defense of order. To huge numbers of Iranians, it now looked like proof that the monarchy had become morally bankrupt. The Shah could still command force. What he was losing, rapidly, was the story. And once a regime loses the story, power starts to leak everywhere. Because revolutions are not only battles in the streets. They are battles over legitimacy, over who speaks for the nation, over who represents justice, faith, dignity, memory, sacrifice, and the future. The Shah still had the palace, the army, the institutions, the money, the symbols of statehood. But his opponents were seizing something far more dangerous: meaning. The protests were no longer just political events. They were becoming moral theater on a national scale. Every funeral became a message. Every march became evidence that fear was thinning. Every strike made the regime look less inevitable. Every crowd raised the same terrifying possibility. What if the monarchy is not permanent after all? And once that question enters a country's bloodstream, it spreads fast. The Shah had spent years projecting inevitability. Now the streets were staging its opposite. What had once looked untouchable was suddenly being watched for weakness. What had once looked modern and commanding was beginning to look old, rigid, and exhausted. The state had not yet fallen. It could still lash out. It could still try to recover. But the emotional center of gravity was moving, and it was moving away from the throne. Once the streets stopped being afraid, the monarchy was already in danger. And in the months ahead, that danger would become something even the Shah himself could no longer control. In the end, the monarchy did not collapse because one enemy defeated it. It collapsed because too many things that once held it together stopped working at the same time. Fear stopped working. Spectacle stopped working. Money stopped working. And finally, even power itself began to look uncertain. That is what made the final months of the Shah's rule so disorienting. For years, the regime had appeared immense, disciplined, almost immovable. It had the army, the court, the ministries, the intelligence apparatus, the oil wealth, the international relationships, the entire visible architecture of a modern state. On paper, it still looked stronger than its opponents. But history does not unfold on paper. It unfolds in confidence. And once confidence breaks at the top of a regime, every institution beneath it starts to feel the tremor. By late 1978, that tremor was everywhere. Demonstrations were growing, strikes were spreading, the economy was faltering under the pressure. Oil workers, civil servants, students, religious networks, bazaar forces, ordinary citizens, all were pulling in different ways at the same weakening structure. The Shah could still issue commands, but command is not the same as control. The state was beginning to move slowly, hesitantly, even as events accelerated around it. And the man at the center of it all seemed increasingly unable to decide what the moment required. That was part of the tragedy. The Shah had ruled for decades through certainty, ambition, and centralization. But now, when the crisis became existential, certainty deserted him. He made concessions, then pulled back. He promised reform, then relied on force. He replaced officials, changed governments, shifted tone, searched for a formula that might preserve the monarchy without fully surrendering its authority. But by then, Iran was moving past formulas. The protests were no longer asking for a better managed version of the same order. More and more, they were moving toward the complete removal of the system itself. And once that momentum takes hold, hesitation becomes fatal. Because the state begins to project what every revolutionary movement waits to see: weakness. That weakness was psychological as much as political. The Shah no longer looked like the master of events. He looked like a ruler being overtaken by them. Even those who feared revolution, even those who worried about chaos, could feel that something profound had changed. The monarchy's aura had cracked. Its permanence no longer felt permanent. Its commands no longer sounded like destiny. They sounded like delay. Then came the moment that made the collapse feel real. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah left Iran. Officially, it was a departure, a temporary absence, a political maneuver wrapped in the language of transition. But almost no one experienced it that way. To supporters, it felt like abandonment. To opponents, it felt like vindication. To the country as a whole, it felt like one of those rare historical seconds when power loses its body and becomes a void. The man who had spent so long presenting himself as the axis of Iran's future was gone, boarding a plane and leaving behind a nation already slipping from his grasp. And once he left, something irreversible happened. The psychological barrier shattered. What had seemed impossible for years now seemed not only possible, but imminent. Crowds celebrated. Old fears drained from the streets. The monarchy still existed formally, but it no longer held the emotional center of the country. That center had shifted elsewhere. Toward return. Toward exile coming home. Toward Khomeini. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran on February 1, 1979, he did not arrive as just another political actor. He arrived as the embodiment of everything the Shah had failed to extinguish. Religion, defiance, memory, legitimacy outside the state. For millions, his return carried the force of destiny. Not because everyone agreed on what should happen next, many did not, but because his reappearance confirmed that the old order had lost the argument at the deepest level. The man cast out by the monarchy had come back to witness its end. And the end came fast, faster than many expected. The institutions that had seemed so formidable began to crack in sequence. Authority fragmented. Parts of the military wavered. The government's last claims to control dissolved into confusion and collapse. On February 11th, the monarchy fell. A state that had looked so modern, so armed, so wealthy, so secure, was gone. Not slowly, not ceremonially, but in a rush of breakdown that stunned the world. That is the most haunting part of this story. Regimes that dominate the skyline often look eternal right up until the week they die. And yet, even in that moment of apparent resolution, the deeper question was still unanswered. The Shah was gone. The throne was broken. The old image of Iran had shattered in full view of the world. But revolutions do not end when a ruler falls. That is when the real struggle begins. Because now Iran had to decide what would rise from the ruins of everything that had just been destroyed. So what do those images actually mean? The women in miniskirts, the crowded cafes, the nightclubs, the boulevards, the universities, the luxury hotels, the modern apartments, the polished ceremonies, the smiling advertisements. The Tehran that looked, in certain frames, almost European, almost interchangeable with the global future the Shah wanted Iran to join. They mean something real, and they mean something incomplete. That is the final truth at the heart of this story. Pre-1979, Iran was not a fantasy invented later. The modernization was real. The transformation was real. The expansion of education, the new visibility of women in public life, the urban growth, the cultural shifts, the ambition, the confidence, the sense that the country was being pushed toward a new century with enormous force. All of that was real. To deny that would be dishonest. But to stop there would be just as dishonest. Because those images were never the whole country. They were a fragment, often the brightest fragment, of a society being remade unevenly, coercively, and at immense speed. They captured what the state could show more easily than what it could not solve. They showed style more easily than strain, aspiration more easily than alienation, visibility more easily than legitimacy. They froze the moment when Iran looked dazzling, but they could not capture the pressure building behind the glass. That is why these photographs remain so powerful now. Not because they tell a simple story of paradise lost, but because they trap a contradiction inside a single frame. When people look at them today, they are often really arguing about something deeper than clothes or architecture. They are arguing about memory, about identity, about what Iran was, what it might have become, and what was destroyed in the collision between monarchy, modernity, religion, nationalism, foreign influence, and revolt. For some, the images represent freedom, openness, sophistication, a country interrupted before it could fully arrive. For others, they represent an elite surface, disconnected from the vast majority of society, sold as national progress while power tightened underneath. Both reactions exist because both touch something true. That is what makes this history so emotionally charged. The Iran before 1979 was not simply free, and it was not simply fake. It was modern in ways that mattered, and unstable in ways that mattered even more. It created possibility, and it created fury. It liberated certain spaces while suffocating others. It expanded horizons while narrowing political life. It promised the future, but it carried an unresolved wound from the past. And in the end, that wound proved stronger than the image built on top of it. And that may be the most important lesson of all. A nation does not survive on appearances, not even magnificent ones. A state can build towers, roads, schools, ministries, armies, and ceremonies. It can flood a capital with light. It can place women in universities, open markets, commission grand architecture, and surround itself with the symbols of advancement. But if large parts of the population feel excluded, humiliated, silenced, uprooted, or ruled rather than represented, then modernity itself can become unstable. Not because modernity is the problem, but because power without legitimacy eventually turns every achievement into evidence for the prosecution. That is what happened in Iran. The Shah did not lose because he changed too little. He also did not lose simply because he changed too much. He lost because he tried to transform a civilization from above, while believing that speed, spectacle, and control could substitute for a deeper settlement with the people being transformed. He built a state that looked formidable from the outside, but inside it carried fractures that wealth could not repair, fear could not silence forever, and progress could not automatically heal. And when that state fell, the world often remembered only the contrast, before and after, skirts and veils, neon and slogans, glamour and revolution. But the real story was never that shallow. The real story is that Iran before 1979 looked nothing like the caricature many people imagine. And yet the more shocking truth is not how modern it looked. It is how fragile that modernity already was. That is why those old images still haunt people, because they do not just show a lost world, they show the final calm before a civilizational rupture. They show how a country can appear self-assured while its legitimacy is collapsing out of frame. They show how history can smile for the camera even as the foundations are beginning to split. And maybe that is the most enduring warning hidden inside them. Not that the past was simple, not that one side had all the truth, but that a nation can shine so brilliantly on the surface that even its own people fail to see the darkness gathering underneath, until it is too late.